And thank you all for joining us. Long Now Boston is committed to fostering long-term thinking in the greater Boston area. Part of that involves engaging with individuals who are working on future-oriented solutions and have a full career ahead of them. We have 5 such individuals with us tonight. The event will be a flash talk style format where each speaker will provide a brief presentation on their work. We may have a follow-up question for that speaker, and then we'll move on to the next speaker. And then we're going to convene all of the speakers together at the end in a panel discussion. And we're going to open up the chat line to questions and kind of try and get as many questions into the speakers as we can, so we have a good roundtable conversation. So to set the stage for tonight, we'd like to share a brief video clip from Roman Kaczmarek, author of The Good Ancestor, a radical prescription for long-term thinking. He is also a former Long Now Boston speaker. So Gary, if you can fire off that video.
Let me show you an image which tries to illustrate this, called The Scale of Unborn Generations. You can see there in the green circle the 7.7 billion people who are alive today. Now, over the last 50,000 years, an estimated 100 billion people have been born and died. But both of these are far outweighed by the nearly 7 trillion people who will be born over the next 50,000 years, assuming current birth rates this century stabilize. In the next 2 centuries alone, tens of billions of people will be born. Amongst them all your grandchildren and their grandchildren and the friends and communities on whom they'll depend. And so there's a really fascinating question there, really, of how will all those future generations judge us for what we did or didn't do when we had the chance? And someone who really thought about this issue was the immunologist Jonas Salk. He was the guy who, with his team in the 1950s, developed the first polio vaccine. But in later life, he said that the great question facing our time is this: are we being good ancestors? In other words, how were we going to be judged by future generations? And he believed that if we were going to be judged well and deal with the long-term challenges that he was seeing at his time, such as the nuclear threat or the destruction of the living world, he believed that we needed to extend our time horizons. So instead of thinking on a scale of seconds, minutes, and hours, we needed to think on a scale of decades, centuries, and even millennia.
Thank you, Gary, and welcome to everyone. You just heard Roman talk about a new generation of time rebels whose long-term thinking is reflected in many areas. And tonight, I think our guests fit this description beautifully. I'm just delighted to welcome all of our speakers this evening. And to kick it off, I'm especially excited to hear from Katherine Ouellette. Welcome, Katherine. Katherine is a writer, communication specialist, and open learning advocate at MIT Open Learning. She's interested in transforming teaching and learning through the innovative use of digital technologies. Katherine creates content on several cutting-edge technologies for the MIT Open Learning newsletter, and she's also a freelance contributor for WBUR. So Katherine, I'd like to welcome you to the Long Now Boston community.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jennifer. Now to kick it off, just a quick note on vocabulary. The office I work for is MIT Open Learning, but I'm going to be talking about the concept of open education. So I'll try not to switch back and forth. Open learning means the office and education means the concept. So
Got it.
When MIT was first considering how to best use the power of the internet for education in 2001, they created OpenCourseWare, a platform where materials for nearly every course at MIT would be available for free to anyone in the world. OCW helped MIT set the standard for open education in the decades that have followed. The open education efforts at MIT have grown in the last 20 years. We launched MITx in 2012 so learners could earn credentials for those online courses, and we opened the Office of Open Learning to continue exploring the untapped potential in open education. So there are many long-term benefits of open education, but I'm going to focus on 3 major themes that I've noticed while working with the MIT Open Learning units. First off, Open education creates more equitable opportunities. For example, the MIT Refugee Action Hub, aka REACT, is a shining example of how open education can create accessible opportunities for vulnerable populations who might not have otherwise had been able to pursue those studies. REACT is a year-long online learning program that creates education to employment pathways for talented refugees and displaced populations. And in true open learning collaboration, MITx and MIT boot camps are a large part of their curriculum. REACT has enabled 3 cohorts of learners to earn their certificate in computer and data science while they have been displaced. And I'm happy to say that the 4th cohort coming up in 2022 will be the largest group yet. So the next concept I wanted to talk about was the idea of engaging the whole self. PK-12 educators might be familiar because of the idea of engaging the whole student was coming up right before the pandemic. But now the pandemic has underscored how important it is to recognize a learner as a complete person who has a life outside of the classroom or even the workplace. Outside factors that affect a student's mental health and general well-being will impact their ability to learn. And even prior to COVID-19, 1 in 5 teenagers would experience severe mental disorder during their lifetime. Providing educators with tools that can increase awareness and improve training surrounding mental illness is key. JWell and the Center for Systems Awareness collaborated over the last couple of years on teacher professional development workshops about compassionate systems that help students understand deeply and respond mindfully. But the more open educational resources that are available to address student health, the more educators that will actually be able to implement those practices more widely. And last but not least, open education fosters exponential innovation. The learner's story of Masi Demis is a favorite around open learning, and he is just such a great example of this impact. After he graduated from his high school in Ethiopia, Demis attended Bunker Hill Community College, and it's there that he first was exposed to OCW courses. He used those courses to then transfer to MIT, and he has since graduated with his bachelor's. Now he's actually working with OCW to increase access to community colleges and to universities across Africa. Demis is just one example of a learner who was inspired to give back to his community after using open educational resources to augment his own education. But we see countless learners who want to use their own opportunities to give back to their communities. But of course, there are also challenges for open education. Accessibility to digital tools and other educational resources can be a problem for learners worldwide who either have limited internet access or if their teachers have limited access to education. Scaling new pedagogy and educational system gets harder and harder depending on how many learners that are in the educational system. And finally, the cost of new solutions might require buy-in from local educational systems and government, and that might create some friction. So where do we go from here? Well, the tireless workers that I encounter in the open education space encourage me to believe that the benefits will persevere over the challenges. The motto that has emerged in the Open Learning Office in 2021 is "Together, we open learning." Open education has always been and always will be a group effort. And with this many educators and learners and researchers on the job, open education truly has the potential to be the great equalizer, and a more equitable society will make for a better world. So with that, thank you. That's my time.
Thank you, Katherine. That was great. Thank you. A quick question. So the open learning is more of a community-based concept, right? Where people can go back and let me back up a little bit. When you say we are open learning, I take it that's more like a collaborative community sort of thing rather than a teacher getting up in front of a classroom and kind of giving information and wanting to get some sort of outcome from that. Is that accurate?
Sure. Yeah, no. So yeah, the Office of Open Learning is comprised of a bunch of different units at MIT, and each of the different units address a different aspect of learning. So as I had opened with, OCW and MITx are probably the most well-known from our office, and those are courses that learners can take. But we also have a number of research and engagement units that are finding the cutting-edge research behind learning education in areas of PK-12, higher education, and workforce learning. So there's a lot of research coming out of all of our units.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Katherine. Wonderful. George, I'll hand it over to you.
My apologies for being muted. Trying to be courteous, I was instead made a mistake. Thanks, Catherine. That was really great, and I can't wait to get into the Q&A. So I've got some questions myself. But now it is my pleasure to welcome David Colby Reed. David is a PhD student at the MIT Media Lab, where he's a member of the Space Enabled Research Group and co-founder of the Space Governance Collaborative. His research focuses on designing participation, voice, and equity into the architectures of complex systems like law, economies, and technologies. David is going to load up his slides, and I see that the slides are up. So David, why don't you go ahead and take it away?
Brilliant. Thank you for the introduction and also the chance to speak with this panel. So I'm David Colby Reed. In this lightning talk, I'd like to tee up a couple of questions to help us think about the potential for democratic social relations that might be possible in outer space and how they might be advanced. And as George was just saying, I'm a member of the Space Enabled Research Group at the MIT Media Lab. And Space Enabled's mission is to advance justice in Earth's complex systems using designs enabled by space. So we take a broad view of sustainability in this group. I mean, projects range from managing debris pollution of low Earth orbit to greener and less expensive propellants for small satellites, which can allow for new mission parameters and new participants in space missions, to projects that use other space-enabled capabilities to support sustainable development on Earth. This evening, I want to tee up a few thoughts in progress on more speculative questions about the prospects for future space exploration. And to do so, I want to analogize from a few past and contemporary contexts. So a version of the big question for now is, how do you quit your job when you work in space? You can't just walk out because space environments are lethal absent technological mediation. And those technologies will require that actions by humans and machines be monitored, standardized, coordinated, and controlled. The lethality of the space environment and the need for technological mediation create conditions that are ripe for what philosopher Elizabeth Anderson calls private government. Now, here it's important to note that government isn't solely a property of a state. It can exist in home or workplaces and so on. But Anderson says you're subject to private government when you're subordinate to authorities who can order you around and sanction you. Private government is government that has arbitrary, unaccountable power over those it governs. And on our present trajectory, future human habitations, occupations, and economies in space will likely be organized as private governments because the systems of objectives, rules, and sanctions that govern them haven't been designed for more democratic forms of decision-making and accountability. The lethality of the space environment will restrict the exit options of those to whom these future governments are private, and will necessitate social hierarchy in order to produce the stuff of life. So how do we see a free society of equals taking root in a context in which surveillance is total, government is private, and non-compliance with authorities can be lethal? We can look to contemporary service work on Earth to illustrate some of the point, right? Much of this work restricts the bodily autonomy of workers and impinges on the uses of their time outside of working hours as well. I have a few slides up, just screenshots showing the denial of bathroom breaks in the poultry industry and workers wearing diapers and consequences of split shift and variable scheduling having bad health consequences and life consequences for workers, right? So this isn't just a phenomenon of low wage or unskilled, I'm doing scare quotes, labor here. The experience of NASA's Skylab 4 mission in 1973 helps illustrate how disparities in standing, power, authority, and esteem can endanger both missions and crew well-being. What we have here is a quotation on the screen from the mission commander of Skylab 4, Gerald Carr, from an oral history by NASA in 2000. And he writes that sorry, I lost my screen for a sec. But the schedule was so dense that if you missed something or if you made a mistake, you'd have to race against the clock and you'd make more mistakes. We found it was almost to the point where you just schedule a time when you could go to the bathroom. We weren't getting the right kind of leisure that would allow us to do the right kind of job, right? So we're not thinking about governance of people in the design of spacecraft and habitations, but we really should be. This is a Blue Origin job description for an orbital habitat formulation lead, and it anticipates core business skills, but doesn't consider the governance and social relations implications of living and working in space. Here's an excerpt from SpaceX's Starlink communications constellation terms of service. It helps to illustrate the underlying assumption of private government. The parties recognize Mars as a free planet and that no Earth-based authority has sovereignty. Accordingly, disputes will be settled through principles established at the time of Martian settlement. I don't mean to pick on Blue Origin and SpaceX here, but as some of the most ambitious actors thinking about humanity's future in space, I think their blind spots reflect our collective blind spots. So to conclude, the design challenge that I wrestle with in a lot of my work is how might we design space habitations and technologies and management systems that enable democratic equality among future spacefarers. So thank you. Stop, sure.
David, wow. My mind is blown. Trying to think about those issues that occur when you're, here we are on Earth, and now you're thinking both ahead in time and out in space, where then time and governance becomes a whole other kind of a thing. Really difficult concepts to wrap your mind around. Very exciting. We had a speaker a couple of years ago, Martin Elvis from Harvard, who gave a presentation on asteroids, asteroid mining, future in space. Great talk. And one of the things he said was to make it simple, there's a possibility, and maybe it's kind of like this private government thing, there's a possibility that space is going to be like the wild, wild west. And one of the things I remember from my childhood watching those old Westerns on TV was, it was the wild, wild west, but still the bad guy got caught in the end. And the phrase that came up was, you can't escape the long arm of the law. So I want you just, can you give a comment about how does the activities of setting laws and requirements and regulatory processes here on Earth, get interpreted out in space? And are there ways to do that when you have colonies and activities that are, theoretically, months or years away from physical access to the Earth?
Well, I think so. That's, I think, an excellent question, and I have only a partial answer to it right now. But part of it is timing, right? In the nearer term future, as we're building space stations in low Earth orbit and in the between Earth and the Moon, generally, you can imagine that earthly power will extend, and we're right now we're governed by laws from the launching state, right? But we are seeing regulatory competitions among certain states to get access to companies that want to do activities in space. I mean, like the US in 2015, Luxembourg, I believe Russia is now moving on this as well, like, are assigning property rights to materials mined from asteroids, for example, and saying that, like, hey, we're not contravening, the Outer Space Treaty, but, we will assign property rights to any any minerals that are mined from entities that launch from our jurisdiction, right? So we can see, like, some kind of legal regime shaping up that extends the laws of launching states into space. In the further future, I suspect that we'll see, like, more kinds of like in the argot of, like, economics and political science, like polycentric governance institutions, governance institutions and governance functions. Oops, sorry, didn't mean to disappear. But functions that are supplied by different actors who are already working in a system. Like in the way that, like, on the high seas or in fisheries or what have you, like, different actors will have overlapping jurisdictional mandates, and so if you're overfishing or fishing out of season, like, other fishing entities can report and govern in that way. I suspect we'll see more of that in outer space. Finally, in the further future and further out, we might see the potential for real monopoly control. When you're thinking about mining asteroids like 100 years in the future, you know, like this creates enormous zones of like compounding competitive advantage, or you know, path dependencies, such that like if you're a first mover that can mine water ice that can be used for fuel that allows you to project further at lower launching costs, then you know there's a increasing return to first mover advantage. In which case, that's a scenario where we might see more private government, right? So we could think about it on different time and spatial scales, but I'll stop there. But thank you for the question.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. Can't wait till we'll have you back at the panel. Our next speaker is a Flash Talk veteran, having spoken with us at our 2019 Flash Talk event. We are happy to welcome back Yi Tao. Dr. Tao developed the MIR framework, that's Mirrors for Earth's Energy Rebalance, while serving as a principal investigator at the Rowland Institute at Harvard between 2016 and 2021. Dr. Tao is currently on a European lecture tour after presenting at COP26 to widely disseminate information foundational to the survival and future prosperity of the human animal. It's great to have you back, Yi. I can't wait to hear for an update from you. And we'll, as soon as we get your presentation loaded, we'll let you get to it. And hopefully we won't have terrible time lags from Slovakia, but and appreciate you staying up so late to give us this presentation. So take it away.
No problem. Can you guys see the screen?
Yes.
Great. All right. Thanks for inviting me back. And it's a pleasure to come back to this audience to share some recent progress. So last time I told you guys that just using very simple linear extrapolation or projection based on historical energy consumption and emission data, we can pretty confidently say that somewhere around 2040, we'll be crossing the 2-degree mark. And since that's a projection a couple of years back, some papers have been published confirming our very simple analysis. And these are based more on much more complicated climate models. And they also indicate that this trajectory will be more or less independent of the emission scenario because of the aerosol cooling effect that we presented during the previous presentation. So the consequence of a warming climate is that we have been observing progressively more challenging production on the agricultural front. And the difficulty in feeding everybody has been partially and attributed to climate impact, which we know include high temperatures, extreme heat events, and the resulting drought from such extreme heat events, and also more dramatic long-term pattern shifts in the climate. So how can we, at least on local scale, adapt to such changes? So to answer that question, we have been conducting 2 field experiments, one in collaboration with a team, actually several teams in New Hampshire, also through an open education network. Actually, Kurt Newton, I think, was at our meetings initially, but because he doesn't really do primary research, so he's waiting until we have some more results to share. So we tested some of these commercial mirrors, which were made to spec to withstand weather. And we'll also talk about another experiment testing the cooling impact of floating mirror arrays on water, because many marine ecosystems are also suffering greatly from thermal stress, such as we observed last year in Western United States and Canada off the shores. So here are some data from the land-based experiment. It's a data collected during July 2021, showing the temperature of the soil underneath the mirror and in the control space that's not shielded by the mirror. We can see that there is a substantial variation of the between the 2 data sets. And we can take the difference to make of the 2 data sets to make the impact more clear. And we call that the temperature anomaly. And we see that at a depth of 10 centimeter, we can have up to 5 degrees Celsius difference between the perturbation and the control. So that's a quite substantial amount of cooling. for the water experiments, we have very similar looking data. And this data set was collected November 2021. So actually during the summer, the variation would be actually larger, but we didn't have the experiment set up yet during July. Another thing you can notice is that the peaks here on land are much sharper, whereas the response in the water system is more sinusoidal. So we'll come back to that characteristic a bit later. So what is driving this passive cooling? Well, the most obvious parameter to look at is the solar irradiance, basically how much sunlight there is. And we can analyze that time series in terms of the different frequency component. So in this plot, we're looking at the frequency component at 1 day inverse. It's like Hertz, but only with a day as the time unit. And we see that the cooling amplitude is more or less proportional to the solar irradiance amplitude. One can actually do the analysis for different frequency components in the temperature response. In the case of the land environments, the slope is roughly the same, meaning that the time constant for the soil is rather short, on the order of a day or less. In the case of the water, we see very different slopes when you're analyzing the response at 1 day inverse versus on longer time scales. So when you give the system more time, the response is stronger for the same amount of solar drive. That's because water has much larger heat capacity, so it takes time to respond. So what do these preliminary data inform us regarding the potential ability of these devices to provide adaptation? Well, we can look to some marine ecosystems that are currently being devastated by heat waves, such as coral reefs. So thermal exposure is quantified in units of degree week. So basically, the product between how much in temperature you're going above normal temperatures multiplied by the duration of that thermal exposure. So both intensity and exposure duration matter in this case. During the November experiment, we were able to measure a total cooling of 6 degree week, which is basically on the same order of magnitude as what's been causing 90 to 100% bleaching of the Great Barrier Reef. And of course, we expect that if the experiment were conducted in regions that's much more has much more solar drive, it's potentially possible to have very dramatic benefit for preventing such devastating events. And there is a study that came out a couple of years ago that suggests during such heat events, if you reduce the amount of light directly shining on the reefs, you can further reduce damage. So the floating mirror arrays is doing both things. It's decreasing how much light is reaching the coral reefs, and it's also reducing the temperature of the water. In terms of agriculture application for land-based mirrors, we more or less demonstrated the possibility to cool soils up to 10 degrees Celsius at the surface. And if that's possible, we can more or less negate the negative impact of global warming on RCP 8.5 trajectories. So that's quite encouraging. And in future experiments, we'll be looking at how much the soils can be kept wetter as a result of shielding by mirror arrays. So to conclude the talk and also to get people start to think about the future, I'd like to highlight this very interesting result. I compiled some data sets that other people compiled on the longevity of different civilizations and different dynasties in human history. And it turns out that these social entities tend to follow a log normal distribution. And if we accept that there's some underlying mechanism that leads to such a distribution, it can be safely claimed that it's very difficult to have human civilizations that lasts for more than a few thousand years. So with that, I'd like to give it back to George, and then we can continue this discussion later.
Yeah, thank you. I love the way you ended it. That graph is really terrific, and it's one of the key interest points for the Long Now to look at long-lived institutions and civilizations, and so it's great to see that out. And so I want to ask you a follow-up question, sort of extending out to that kind of a time frame consideration. If this technology is very successful, you've proven it on kind of a pilot stage, and now we take it out into a deployment phase. Is this something that could scale to? It sounds like it's kind of, you're looking at it as a local kind of mitigation factor, but can you imagine that being scaled up to be something that would be useful on more of a global scale?
Thanks for the question. So if you remember, in my original Flash talk, I started out at the global scale. So over the past 2 years, we have done the whole round trip, going from the global down to nitty-gritty of the small individual devices, and then have done the analysis of scalability. And indeed, this framework is entirely scalable. We have sufficient reserve in soda lime glass to tackle CO2 concentration up to 1,100 ppm. So that's way beyond what we have in fossil fuel reserve. So having enough material is not an issue. The energy cost needed to scale this, basically to keep current climates, is about 3.6% of annual global energy consumption, which is also feasible. What is perhaps a challenge is that we need political will and also understanding from the public to really support this technology. The reason for that is we need to more or less scale the glass manufacturing industry by like 10 to 30 times. So that's only possible if we have coordinated effort globally to really implement such glass foundries everywhere in order to produce the mirrors. Other than that, we have enough material, enough energy, but what's lacking behind is education. There's a lot of confusion in the climate space of what should be done. And people in engineering departments are still thinking that clean energy will solve everything. It's clearly not sufficient. The climate monster has taken on a life of its own. And so that even if we stopped emitting, 20 years ago, it's already too late. So some sort of thermal offset is certainly necessary for us to survive past the current generation.
Well said, well said. I'm going to turn this over to Jennifer now. We'll catch you later on the panel. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Yi. I have some questions for you too as well when we get to that time. But for now, I'm very pleased to introduce our next speaker, Sudeep Agarwala, who I met through a mutual somebody that I know who he works with. So I was just feeling totally lucky and fortunate to be able to meet Sudeep and invite him here with us this evening. Dr. Agarwala is a synthetic biologist at Ginkgo Bioworks. He's fascinated by how microbes can be engineered to produce different compounds to address issues around, resource limitation and climate change. Sudeep is excited about science communication and public engagement around genetic engineering and biotechnology. He also has writings that have appeared in the Washington Post and Grow magazine and is currently under contract with Harvard University Press. So Sudeep, we're very pleased to welcome you here to Long Now Boston this evening. Thank you.
Hi, really honored to be here as well. These talks have been pretty spectacular, and I hope I can live up to the previous speakers as well as the one coming after me. A little different talk today. I believe I'm the only one here speaking from industry. So I wanted to motivate what we do at Ginkgo Bioworks and why I'm excited to be part of Ginkgo Bioworks. Namely, to put it into 6 easy words, we make biology easier to engineer. Perhaps that seems mysterious to you, so I'd like to motivate that statement by this following picture. In front of you, you have I'm showing you this beautifully laid out desk. I wish my desk looked as nice. And on it, you can see a bunch of technologies, very early technologies, writing in the lower left-hand corner, mechanical energies. You can take a look at the Newton's cradle in the upper right-hand corner, or even the camera or watch. We have electrical energy in the lamp, as well as digital technology in the tablet, the cell phone, and the computer. Now, the question I'd like to ask you, or ask you to think about, is which of these technologies is the most advanced? And perhaps you've already guessed where I'm coming from, but at Ginkgo Bioworks, we actually think this unassuming plant is the most advanced technology. Why? Well, none of these other technologies have the ability to self-repair, and many of you who might own plants know that if you've ripped off a leaf, it grows another leaf. Self-assemble for the gardeners in the audience. If you put a seed, it will replicate the same plant. Usually, asterisk, I'm a geneticist. Variations abound, but in general, if you plant a seed, you're going to get the same plant whose seed you planted. Self-replicating, and it's renewable as well. So, when we think about biology, we also think about how we can program this biology. We know that a lot of the attributes to a living thing is encoded in the series of A, T's, G's, and C's that comprise its DNA. Now, we can make changes to those A's, T's, G's, and C's and have a readout that we can predict. Now, Ginkgo Bioworks takes this idea of engineering biology and breaks it into a testable cycle. That is, we design DNA, we're able to synthesize our own DNA, we're able to build organisms using our world-class foundries, and we're able to test those organisms to see which one of those organisms are able to have the functions that we want it to have, right? And iterating through this cycle has resulted some really interesting results. It's allowed us to enter into a bunch of different areas that perhaps you wouldn't have expected to. When you think about biology, you think about therapeutics or different industrial biotechnology. But do you really think about the food that's on your table? Do you really think about biodefense or consumer electronics? I'm just going to go through a few of the areas that we've been moved into because of our ability to write and construct organisms. First off, one of our spin-offs, Motif, Foodworks, is thinking very hard about the future of food. So many of you might have a chicken dinner for Shabbat on Friday nights. What if you're able to grow that same food without having to harm an animal that requires months, days, months, years to come to maturity? Nitrogen fixation has been a huge boon to humanity, and it's allowed for sustaining this current populations. But it's also an incredibly energy-intensive process. What we know, however, is that there's organisms already in the soil that are fixing nitrogen for us and allowing crops to grow. What if you can engineer those organisms to be more efficient and have relationships with different organisms? What if you could literally grow nitrogen fertilizer? I wouldn't accuse anyone on this call of having tried or grown their own marijuana, but perhaps you're growing your own tomatoes, and you know how much energy goes into those grow lights to make those tomatoes grow. In the case of marijuana or other drugs, the range of the pharmacopoeia that comes from these plants can be very high to very low, and you have to grow a lot of these plants in order to isolate milligrams of the relevant compounds that you need. Again, what if you could use fermentation and this ability to design biology in order to grow these precious compounds, which are important medicines to a lot of us? And then finally, we're living in a world where we're starting to see a scarcity of antibiotics. Biology is very smarter than us in many cases, and we need to be constantly in the search for different antibiotics. So a lot of our work with Ginkgo Bioworks is partnering to find different microbes from soil bacteria. Right? I've done a lot, but if there's one thing that I want you to take away from this talk, it's that biology is fundamentally programmable, and that we can manipulate the series of A's, T's, G's, and C's in order to grow a lot of things that we wouldn't have thought to grow before. In short, we're here to make biology easier to engineer. Really appreciate the time.
Wow, Sudeep, that was great. Thank you so much.
Very generous. Thank you.
As someone who's done molecular microbiology for many years, I'm always astounded about how genetic engineering technology has been advanced. You know, I used to have to send my genes out to get sequenced. I wouldn't get something back for 48 hours, just a 800 base pair gene or something, say. So it's just really an incredible, I think, testament, I think to you and to the Ginkgo Bioworks too, for this kind of innovation and persistence and tenacity and kind of using these technologies to help drive forward so many different areas. But I kind of latched on to the soil bacteria and was just wondering, I'm curious what stage that's at. Because I'm wondering about the durability of such engineered organisms in a native soil, for example. Like if you're put it in a cornfield or something like that. I was just curious about how effective that is over the long term, if you know that information. I'd be interested.
So a bunch of thoughts arising from that. One is, there is an entire network of communication going on in the ground right beneath our feet that we never even begin to think about, and it's really hard to study that on a ticking time. The time is running out for that, because as Ye mentioned before, right, the changes in the climate and the changes in temperatures that we're seeing are actually affecting the microbiome of the soil that's surrounding us, right? But what we can do, and the approaches that people are taking, is to understand the bacteria in the soil through their DNA. So you can archive the bacteria through understanding the DNA that's in there, that's in the bacteria themselves, and that's a matter of extracting the DNA and then sequencing it. And we have varying levels of technology that allow us to actually understand the genomes of the bacteria that are in there. Now, one of the things which is really, one of the ways to think about this is not to actually identify the bacteria and the antibiotics that are in the soil, but to think about the potential for what those bacteria can be, right? And this is where a technology like Ginkgo Bioworks can really come in handy, right? You can take a look at segments of that DNA, and predict what proteins are being produced by that segment of DNA. Since you have the DNA in hand, but you don't have the organism, you can then take those segments of DNA and put them in another organism, right? And that's much easier to grow than these really complicated bacteria that live in the soil. And in that way, you can generate the antibiotics that the original host would have produced. You can think about this in, we like to talk about Jurassic Park in quite a bit. In Jurassic Park, they took the DNA from the mosquito in amber, injected it into an alligator, and produced a dinosaur. Similarly, if we could take the DNA extracted from soil and put it into our favorite organism, yeast, bacteria, mammalian cells, whatever, we can then make the antibiotics that were originally being produced. Not to sensationalize.
Of course not. Thank you, Sudeep.
Yeah, thank you, Sudeep. That was great. We're going to move on to our fifth and final speaker of the night. And that is Anastasia Ostrowski. Anastasia is a PhD student and design researcher at the MIT Media Lab. Her work focuses on equitable design of robots, including co-design and participatory design approaches. Anastasia is also a fellow of the RSA and co-leader of their New England program. That's how I originally met Anastasia, and also mentioned Danny Warshay as a member of that group. So delighted to have you with us tonight, Anastasia. I can see your slides are up, so why don't you take it away?
Perfect. Thanks for the great introduction, George. And it's really exciting to be here today. And with, like as Sudeep was saying, so many amazing panelists. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about developing equitable robot design processes. Really thinking about, we need to start thinking about how we develop these in order to make sure our robots are more equitable in the future. And so when you think of robots, you may see some headlines like this: robots alone can't solve Amazon's labor woes. Or, can we make our robots less biased than we are? AI developers are committing to end the injustices in how their technology is often made and used. And so what we know is, like, robots are fairly in their infancy in terms of technology coming into the spaces that we generally interact in. However, we are already seeing issues with the technology and how it integrates in our context, our social context, and how it works with people. And so a lot of the robots that are coming in nowadays, we need to start thinking about how are we designing these and how can we make sure that the processes that we use are equitable to help prevent against creating new inequities in society or perpetuating ones that already exist. So the two robots on the screen here, the one on the left side of the slide is, an industrial robot. And the one on the right, you may not be familiar with, but it's a social robot. And so what these robots can do is they can engage with you in more social ways, whether that's looking at you when you're talking, or maybe it could nod to let you know that it's acknowledging you. And so those are the robots that I mostly focus in my work. And they broadly kind of go under the umbrella of voice user interfaces. And so a voice user interface can be something like a smart speaker. So Amazon Echo, which is shown on the top left, and in the middle there is Google Home. But it can also contain this area of robots called social robots. And so this is a social robot called Jibo. We use it a lot in the personal robots group. And it was created by my advisor, Cynthia Brazil. And what I really look to understand is, okay, with these robots coming into these spaces, how do people engage with them? How does it impact how people engage generally? Is it different than how we engage with people? How does it affect how we as people engage with other people? And how do these interactions help people flourish? And also thinking about, okay, if there's such potential in this technology, how do we really make sure that they're equitably designed so we're not creating new inequities or perpetuating existing ones? And so if we start with kind of our technology here, we can sort of build out a model of how we're approaching this to start thinking about the equitable design of this tech. So we have three different areas that I'm going to talk about. So the first one is thinking about, okay, designers. Who are designing those technologies? Who gets to be called a roboticist? Who gets to be included in a design team? And also, what values do they have? And how are those values being embedded into the technology that then goes out into society? Then we can think about the users, but not just the users as they're the person that's going to interact at the very end, but how can we bring them into the design process so that they're very early on designing the technology with the design team to help understand the context that these robots will go into and what do people need from this technology. And lastly, we can think about the policy dimension. So as we're designing these technologies in a more equitable manner, how can we loop in sort of this future focused vision, thinking about how will this technology impact society and how can policy either help that or how can policy be leveraged to include everyone together in this conversation. And so I see these all as very much interrelated as we think about how to design these technologies equitably. And we also put this on a foundation of design justice. So design justice is drawing from the work of Sasha Cosenza-Chock, and it really goes into thinking critically about how these technologies are designed and considering more so than just the technology, but the design process, where this design is happening, how is it harming society, and also thinking about what are the benefits that it's giving to people. So with that, I'm going to wrap it up, but I just want to say thank you again, and I'm looking forward to the panel.
Oh, that's excellent. Thank you, Anastasia. That was a great presentation. I did have a question for you, and that's goes to the natural human tendency to anthropomorphize. So we're interacting with something, something's interacting back, and don't we tend to put sort of the human faculties, just believe that those are in this process of interaction. And, and we've seen people talk to their Alexia or talk to Siri in a way that's very personalized. So humans have this tendency to personalize objects. And I imagine for robots, this can be a big plus if you have, companion robots. It's a real big plus that people do that. But isn't it also a big potential for manipulation and misunderstanding? And so does that process that you described help to address that problem?
It helps it to be more highlighted as something to discuss. So I think a lot of times roboticists will be like, oh, this is really cool. I want to use this. It's super awesome. And then there's something that happens that you can't really explain. So I think Kate Darling has talked here before, correct? So I don't know if she shared this story with you, but Boston Dynamics, I don't know if you've seen the robot Spot, but it's like, it looks like a dog. We think it looks like a dog. And they produced a video where they were kicking Spot, and when it got out, people were enraged and upset, and they were testing it. Like the engineer perspective was, look, if you kick it, it's going to come back. Like, that's really cool. But to everyone else, people were so upset because they're like, you're kicking this dog. I mean, PETA was getting calls about this robot dog because people had such a strong reaction to it. And it was something where those engineers, I don't know them personally, but I would really doubt that they were thinking, oh, I'm gonna kick a dog like robot. They were thinking, I want to show this cool feature. But I think it is a really interesting example to really contextualize if in those processes, when we make those, if we're considering, oh, how does it look? What is the look saying? How can people relate to this? And just make it more of a conversation as well. Because I think robots for a long time have really lived in labs, and they may be more so in other contexts, but for the majority, not everyone in their house has a robot right now. And so kind of thinking, since a lot of this research and whatnot has been in labs, now we're thinking about, oh, when a user is going to have it in their everyday life, what are we going to have to consider? And so that's why I think we're at a really critical point to start asking, how should we design these so they are more equitable, or that we consider all of these dimensions?
Yeah. Oh, that's great. So on the one hand, it's better if you kick your Roomba than if you kick your dog, but we're not quite sure why. So that's great conversation. Thank you. And I'm going to turn this back to Jennifer. I think you're up. Thank you.
Yes, thanks, Anastasia. That was really wonderful. And thanks to all of you, Katherine, David, Ye, and Sudeep, for giving us some really great insight into your fields, your disciplines, what you're interested in. And we're all here together now, kind of ready to take some questions from the audience. If you have a question for the speakers, please feel free to post it into the chat, and we will be sure to get that question to the speakers so that they can answer it. George and I have a few questions of our own, and also kind of want to just remind the speakers, please feel free to engage with each other if you have a question for another speaker. We're interested in getting this conversation going, and and asking questions and learning from each other. And I'd kind of like to start off by asking a broad general question, and it may seem a bit redundant at first, but I'm hoping maybe there will be some speculation here or something, maybe just kind of opening up some back and forth. But I'm hearing different threads of equity and communication and education, and how we need to bring these sorts of technologies in an equitable way across the globe, whether it be robotics or space technologies. And, Katherine, you talked about the education, and I think we agree that that's a really important aspect of it. So, if we went around the room here, what do you think is the biggest challenge facing your field when we're thinking about these aspects of it? How do we tell people about these technologies? How do we get political will? How do you see that part happening for our future? And, Anastasia, maybe we could start with you, since you were just talking about the robotics, but I'm very interested to hear what you have to say about that.
Sure. Yeah, I think there's always a ton of challenges that we can always go into. But I actually think Katherine did a phenomenal job of summarizing the challenges that we experience the most. So with co-design or participatory design, the goal is to bring people into the design process, but that can be very time intensive and it can be also cost prohibitive, and also how do you create partnerships with communities, especially when there's been a history of harm between institutions like universities and different communities. So I think for us, it's really kind of scaling up the methodology and finding ways so it is easy for people to do. And I think on the other hand of that, in order to do that, it's also supporting more interdisciplinary teams in this area. So I think one of the great things about the Media Lab in my group per se is, I'm a design researcher working with a bunch of computer scientists, and we can't do our work without each other. And so, it just shows sort of the right space there is for robotics to be bringing in so many fields to work together. So I think it's kind of, making this interdisciplinary thing. I think people are attracted, they want to do it. Like, how do we kind of decrease the barriers for us to be more interdisciplinary and bringing more people and more voices to the table?
Thank you. Yeah, yes, that last part in particular really resonates, I think. Thank you, Anastasia. Sudeep, how do you feel about that?
Well, how do I say this without getting into too much trouble? I think Anastasia has sort of fielded questions in the past, has fielded questions about the robot apocalypse. There are movies out there that engage with the robots taking over the world. Think about The Matrix, right? Ye has sorry, am I pronouncing your name correctly? Do you prefer Ye or Yi? I apologize.
Either one is fine.
Okay. Ye has Snowpiercer to contend with, right? There's, when you start thinking about geoengineering and geoengineering climate change, you have all these apocalyptic ideas. The thing which I struggle with most is that there have already been really irresponsible players in the GMO space, right? When we think about GMOs, we think about Monsanto, and we think about people taking advantage, using this powerful tool, biology, to take advantage of a lot of other people. And we also think about sort of very hopeful products being shut down by people who I think rightfully are very scared, but who have also been demonized in the media, right? We think about golden rice, which has incredible amounts of potential, but got shut down by protesters. Now, I'm not saying that one is either right or wrong, but there's a lot of discussion to be had, which gets shut down by people who are very passionate about their opinions on these sorts of things. And it's interesting because we're currently in this space where biology has the ability to do a lot of very powerful things, right? We can have the Impossible Burger, which many of you have tried, which is all GMO technology. We have the ability to engineer microbes to do carbon sequestration as well as nitrogen sequestration for fertilizers. And the question is, how do we engage with the public, and how do we build political will, which isn't coercive, right? Which isn't taking a very strong stance on either one, but really playing this middle ground about what is the technology, how do we get this conversation and education about what GMOs are, their positives as well as their negatives, and part of it is showing some form of vulnerability that even I, as a scientist, would not necessarily endorse GMOs in every situation, and that there needs to be a real open and frank conversation about where we want to see this technology taking us, and where we really have question marks that need to be answered. But I think the answer here, as it is with almost everything, is increasing discourse and public education before we get political wills involved in making binary yes or no decisions.
Thank you, Sudeep. That was very thoughtful. I appreciate that. Ye, would you be willing to also address the question?
Yeah, I can probably speak to the challenge specific to the climate work that we're trying to do. So the more that we're trying to do this work in a nonprofit fashion, the more we realize that what's really difficult is the current capitalistic system in which we're all embedded in. So just as one example, so oftentimes it's not really the really effective and scalable solution that get funded. It's oftentimes the ones that are profitable at small scale, but basically not scalable. One example being direct air capture of carbon. So this process basically requires consuming 10 times the CO2 that it can capture. So if we were to scale this globally, we would essentially in 15 years deplete the global reserves in fossil fuels just to run the process while doing nothing to the actual CO2 that's out there in the atmosphere. So that's basically what comes out if you do the calculations. And they are selling CO2 sequestration for $1,000. Compare that to $50 for the fuel that you burn. So basically, it's roughly 20 times. But these things get funded because it's profitable on the short term, but not on the long term. We've been approached in the past 2 years by companies such as Siemens trying to commercialize some of the things we haven't really talked about in public, but we have so far refrained from doing so because we don't think setting up another for-profit company is going to do any good for the system in the long run. So it's very difficult for people who social entrepreneurs who want to make a difference in the space to really do something useful because the whole system has its own momentum. And most people, those of us on this call are very privileged to have free time on a Monday evening to enjoy life, are basically just working at the subsistence level. And we can maybe later go into the psychological impact of that on human life fulfillment, but that's a little bit off topic. But I would suggest people looking at work by the likes of Julian Assange, Noam Chomsky, Steve Donziger, these real fighters, many of whom have been deprived of the ability to speak to the public of the amazing work and important social work they're trying to accomplish. So I think from our perspective, capitalism is really what's hijacking the system and dictating our path to potential human extinction within the coming decades to a couple of centuries.
Thank you, Ye. Thank you. David, I'm curious your thoughts. The space enabled, right, to allow space technology to be used by people across the globe. What's the, how do we get, kind of in the same vein of what we're talking about? How do we tell people about that? How do we communicate it? How do we make sure that this is accessible to them?
I think that's a very interesting question. I'm glad you asked. I mean, I think maybe by way of analogy or story is the best way to approach it first. I mean, in a prior arc of my career, I worked on international development questions, in particular financial sector access and access to affordable, safe, reliable financial instruments. And a big chunk of that work was working on the product and regulatory design for mobile phone-based payment services. And I think that's such an interesting example of how different people with different needs in different contexts will use the same technologies to different ends. In the mid-aughts, early 2010s, like the primary use case for mobile phone-based payments in the US was ringtones that you would download to your phone and, you know, assign to different
Yeah.
contacts. I say this because it sounds like something out of the very distant past. And, you know, at the same time, we saw like using not smartphones, using dumb phones, using SMS, you know, like fairly like basic technology, but using the mobile network and agents of mobile network operators and folks where you could buy prepaid cash and so on. In developing country contexts like Kenya in particular, you saw the development of services like M-Pesa, which is it's a Venmo that predated Venmo by a number of years, right? And because there was a need for reliable money transfer at low costs, and there was this architecture of infrastructure of mobile phone networks, but not an infrastructure of consumer banking, right? And so rather than send money to, like, if you're a young person working in Nairobi and you're sending money to your, you know, mother who lives in a more remote village, and you're doing it with the bus driver who goes there once a week, you know, like having access to a mobile, like you text message money and use like the point of sale for buying airtime as a cash in, cash out point. There's an entirely new use case and a whole new infrastructure that is built on top of an existing infrastructure that that is then supported a variety of other things, right? You know, you see, you know, like worked with a startup at one point that was working on, you know, enabling mobile phone-based payments for like small and medium-sized businesses. People are getting like paying taxes through mobile phone payments and so on. And so, yeah, you know, I think this encapsulates an example of how any kind of technology, once access is more democratized and open, you start seeing like possibilities that we can't imagine very well. And so some of the folks in my group work on questions of like, how can we use satellite remote sensing data to address and respond to climate change, or respond to invasive species spread, or, you know, as inputs into modeling the spread of infectious disease and modeling policy responses to that. Like, you can use satellite and, you know, LiDAR and other like remote sensing data to like feed into models that allow for different use cases, right? Like, so the scope of our questions is broadly enhanced when we have a wider swath of people who can use technology to ask questions. And, you know, Anastasia was talking about design justice in toward the end of her prepared remarks there, and I think that's that angle of like, oh, when we make meaningful co-design available to people, when we make tools accessible, and we can develop new use cases. And so I think that equity was, you know, in the technology access and technology steering kinds of questions ends up growing the pie in ways that we can't anticipate very well in advance. And so that's one of the things that excites me about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. Yes. Yeah. And you use such an interesting word there, the democratization, you know, of things. And that kind of leads me to you, Katherine, a little bit, because do you see, I mean, that's as kind of what open learning is about, right? And so can a platform like open learning, can it support these various, you know, we're talking about robotics and genetic engineering and climate change and space exploration, and can open learning support the education and communication to these disciplines in these areas, you know, across the globe? What do you think about that?
Sure. Well, we certainly do try. Well,
Mm-hmm.
Open learning is kind of a nexus point of all the research that goes on at MIT, because we actually have a collection of research scientists called the Digital Learning Lab, and they are each faculty members in their respective departments. So my job as a communicator is to try to find interesting stories about cool research that the wider world would want to know about, figure out what the story is there, and then package it in a way that I think people will want to read, whether that's a blog post, trying to elevate it to an MIT news story, tweeting about it, writing a Facebook post about it, LinkedIn. So if we had the magic bullet, I would be in much higher demand right now than I currently am. We try to throw everything on the wall and see what sticks. I think the great thing about MIT is everybody loves to learn, and everybody, in my experience, everybody is really supportive of each other's projects. So that's kind of the lovely environment that I'm in at Open Learning. And so I think to Anastasia's point is we really see the value in exchanging all these different perspectives, and maybe you come up with new ideas that if you had been isolated in your own department, you wouldn't have considered before. So to get back to your original question, I guess, yes, we would love to have any of you share your research more deeply. We do a monthly talk series over Zoom like this and upload it to YouTube. We're interested in everything and anything, especially for my fellow MIT staff members here.
That's great. Those are great answers to that question. There are a couple on the chat I wanted to touch base on. We have a couple for Yi. One is a fairly simple one, I think, in concept, and that is you have the deployment of these mirrors, which are very good reflective surfaces that get the radiation back out, so we don't have to worry about it. But at the same time, that's food for the plants. So how do you integrate kind of mirror arrays and growing crops at the same time? How's that going to work? Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yes, we've been thinking about that quite a bit. So it turns out that for many or most of the crop species, they cannot actually make use of all the photons. Above 600 micromole per second per meter squared of flux density, they saturate, the photosynthetic response saturates. So especially in mid latitudes where there's basically too much sunlight, and the excess can either hurt the plant or just basically increase evaporation. The presence of the mirrors with lower the temperature make many of them potentially even more effective at producing sugars on a per area basis than if the mirrors weren't there. So that's one thing. The other is it's entirely possible, to engineer mirrors to have to basically modulate the type of frequency of light that arrives at the plants. So basically frequency selective mirrors. So we're also designing those, which can selectively reject frequencies that are not contributing to photosynthesis.
Yeah, good. Question for Katherine. The question is, in terms of the open learning concept, how do you work with things like, lab work, which is a sort of a very physical activity that has to take place under certain conditions and confinement, and so how does that factor in?
Sure. So I did answer this in the chat, so I'll just try to summarize quickly. Where research labs were one of the few things that were still open throughout the pandemic, but some of the MIT courses were able to repackage their materials depending on the subject, where some instructors were really creative about sending mini kit versions of the resources they were going to use in class, mailing them to all the students, rethinking what the projects might be, using objects you can find around your house. So the pandemic forced a lot of quick thinking, and at this point in time, we're considering everything that we've learned, and it's like, okay, these are the desperate solutions. What's actually something that is worth keeping around and actually worked really well. And so I think we'll see more of that in the future.
Great. And a question for Anastasia. I think if I understand this correctly, you had the three pillars, sort of the users and the designers, and then the policy or the regulatory framework or something. Well, so what happens when there's disagreement, or how does this generate some kind of understanding or consensus that can actually then be embodied in a robot?
Yeah, so I think as with all design, like you're always going to have conflict. And there's actually a lot of cool research in the human computer interaction space that has very much outlined, if you want to be engaging in equitable design processes, you have to acknowledge conflict and also kind of accept it and move with it. And I think that's a really important thing for us to be doing in robot design as well. Each of these stakeholders are in their own network of stakeholders. They each have different demands. And as Randy had in the chat, different value systems, right? So what we see as a community's values for having a robot in, let's say, a community center could be very different than the motivations or the values for the designers. And let's say now we want to have a robot in multiple different centers in a city. What is the local government's value system going to impact those? So with a lot of the work, it's not so much saying we're not going to have conflict. It's not saying this is going to be easier. We're going to make our lives easier with this. It's really working towards acknowledging that there will be conflict, but let's look at our values and make this a front and center conversation that we're all going to have with everyone at the table, so everyone's voices are heard, versus a situation where if you don't have someone at that table, then their values aren't even considered. So we may be producing what you could call more conflict, but in the long run, with having more voices, we'll have more perspectives taken into account and hopefully design something that is more equitable.
Right. And I think that the theory or the practice has often been the designers come up with something that they think people are going to use in a way that they think they're going to use it. Well, just why don't you ask them, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And I think, I mean, I think that's very much something how like I thought I actually have a background in engineering, and I came in and I was like, I'm going to work with people. This is going to be so fun. And I got there and I realized, wait, there's no people. Like, why in my design class am I not talking to anyone? I don't know anything. I was doing biomedical. I don't know anything about multiple sclerosis. I have no idea how it feels. Why aren't we talking to people? And so that's always been my first question is like, yes, let's just go talk to someone.
Great, great. So we're the time is passing. Don't want to. It's been a great conversation. Don't want to shortchange it. I want to kind of change this a little bit and ask kind of a thought question about looking out into the future. So now take yourselves out to say 70 years old, or so you're 70 years old now. You're kind of retired, and by the way, that's my age. So I'm kind of you're retired and you're looking back at the field that you've been working in for your career, and imagine what you hope to see from the work that you've done and you've started now. And so just take a look at that. Turn it into a sentence or two, kind of an aspirational, this is what it looks like. And it's kind of a long-term thinking a practice, a way of thinking about things. So Katherine, why don't we start with you this time?
Sure. I think the answer that I have would be the answer that anyone, especially a parent, would want to give, is that every child has access to education. And so as David was mentioning, that using phones for education, that's a tool that is just in its infant stages right now. If they don't have internet access, they can use phones to be connected to the wider world. So hopefully that kind of technology grows exponentially, and no matter where you are in the world, you have access to the same opportunities.
Right, equitability, access, transparency, those values. That's great. And moving now, if I remember the sequence right, David.
Sure. I mean, I'll try to shoehorn in a brief response to Randy's question too about the different roles of folks living and working in space. I think I say all this with like the proviso that it's all subject to change and so on. I might amend my thoughts here, but I think like we need a different mental model for what it means to be an employee or a member of a team or what have you in some of these future contexts, right? Our mental model of what it means to be someone of working age has changed over time. We no longer see child labor as acceptable in this country at this time, right? Like our sense of who a worker is has evolved. And I think that, we need to continue thinking about that kind of evolution. And, especially in the case of space exploration, or if we're thinking, decades in the future where there are more private space stations or other sorts of sites beyond Earth where some of these questions of autonomy and control come up. I mean, I think we need to borrow from other domains to inform a sense of like what a worker is like in that sense. It's maybe more of like a citizen kind of relation than an employer-employee relation, right? And if we're borrowing from citizenship, like how do we think about what are the inputs to make citizenship like a real prospect in different contexts? I think a big part of that comes down to a kind of equality between people. And here I'm borrowing from Anderson again, but democratic equality or relational equality, like how do you stand in relations of equality to other people, independent of these power relations, or you know, to perhaps preempt some of these power relations. So if our sense of what it means to be an employee or worker expands with time, I think that would be a career win, right? in that
Excellent.
way. Sorry, that was a long answer.
Yeah, David, that's excellent. And I think we could safely say that everyone is a member of the long now, you know, the past, the future. So that's great. Thank you. Yi.
I think my vision is very similar to what David just said. I think it's very important that we realize that as a civilization, as a species, we should prioritize the fulfillment of life satisfaction as our collective goal. And to do that, there needs to be a decoupling of the pursuit of wealth from the pursuit of other extrinsic markers of success, including power, status, and fame. So the pursuit of power, status, and fame shouldn't be a route to money, which then gives access to other things. In the end, it's basically in primitive societies and small human tribes, it's access to necessities for survive, but we're way past that. So we need to make the decoupling. And if we can do that, then we will be able to really both satisfy the hedonic needs of people, the basic survival needs and comfort and pleasure, but also we would be able to make the pursuit of authenticity and growth and excellence and spirituality intrinsic motivators, and through the pursuit of which, then we can have, you can attain power, status, and fame through that, but that should not be a mean to obtain monetary wealth.
And if you've done that, your use of power and status will be very different. That's really
right.
Well said. Yeah, really well said. Thank you.
Yeah.
Sudeep.
Yeah. Where are we going to be in 70 years' time? And I think one of the things that I'd like to do is look back where we were, say, 100 years back in time, and not at biology, but let's take a look at computing. Because 100 years ago, we were, it was. We were just discovering computing, right? We had all these mechanical ways of computing, and that sort of developed into a technology that became electronic. So in order to look 70 years ahead, right? Like let's look 30 years back in time, right? So let's say it's the early 90s, late 80s. We've just found ways to synthesize DNA. We've just found ways to transform different organisms, right? And that brings us to our current moment, where we are now finding ways to develop these platforms, stitching DNA together in large and large pieces, like Jennifer was talking about, right? Creating genes and being able to design these genes. I don't want this to sound optimistic. I want this to be a neutral statement that in 70 years' time, let's imagine a world where we are engineering organisms and engineering biology the same way that people are going to Apple and using their platform to come up with their next program and come up with their next great idea. We have smartphones that we don't think about the ons and offs or the circuitry inside of it. Inside there, we think about the language and the end result that we want to do. We want to have a car pick us up. We want to design an app which will deliver us dinner at whenever we don't feel like going out. And the analogy is in 70 years' time, what if we had a platform that was able to build an organism that was able to do whatever you'd like? the reason this is a neutral statement is because this requires a lot of deep thought into what we want the future to look like. Because just like with computers, there's a lot of really beneficial uses, right? As we found out over the past 2 years. And it's the reason why we're able to have this conversation I'm having right now. But there's a lot of really dark uses of that technology as well. That's happened because for many reasons, it was unregulated, or the regulation of electronics as the internet and computing came far behind the technology. Is there a way with biology and the next revolution that we're thinking about, we can keep on top of that and make sure that a lot of the dark uses don't follow?
Great observation. And I love the idea of sort of imagining the ability to create organisms. You now are talking about sort of the wetware approach to building robots or specialized organisms. And so, Anastasia, that gets to you. What do you see out 50 years looking back?
Also, Steve, I just want to say I totally agree, right? The whole notion of let's just stay on top of things. We know we won't stay on top of everything, but that would be great if we could. But no, I think for me, it comes down to something, George, you said, where it's like, let's talk to someone to be the default, and not just someone who's an expert. Let's go talk to the community that has those lived experiences. So that would be great if in 70 years, like that's our default to technology design, is not designing for communities or people, but designing with them. And then also that when you want to become a technology designer or a designer, your education has that component in it. The emphasis is on, we're going to design with people, not simply for them.
Excellent, well said. So we're going to take a little break and then do some informal chit chat. So we're going to turn it back over to Kim, I think. Is that right, Jennifer? If Kim is still there, we'll see if he's alive. Oh.
I'm alive. I'm down at the bar already. We're about to open up the conversation to the group for people who want to still hang out. And first, I'd like to give a big thank you to our new wave presenters, to Katherine, David, Yi, Sudeep, Anastasia. I'd also like to give another shout out to George and Jennifer for curating these conversations and being our guides through the flash talks. To our production team, Gary, Mary, and Riyag. Please visit our website, stay in touch on social media, become a member. Watch your mailboxes for signups for our conversation with Kerry Tribe on Monday, March 7th. Now, let's go down to the bar. The first round is on me, and conversation for those that would like to stay online for a while. Feel free to unmute yourselves. Please raise your hand. We'll do our best to ensure that anyone who wishes to speak is their opportunity. And for those who wish to leave, thank you very much for attending. Stay well and good night. George?
Yeah, great. Jennifer, Mary, this was really fascinating. We had such a wide range of issues, 5 really articulate and thoughtful and exciting speakers. So it's great to hear all of you. And let me just sort of, it's open mic now. And let me just ask any of the 5 of you, if you have a question that you want to pop out there for either one of your co-speakers or one of us, love to. Yeah, okay, Yi is raising his hands. What do you got?
Question for Anastasia. So in your field, what is the future, like, and vision for perfect ratio of number of robots to number of people alive, and how many of what type, and what are their power consumptions? I'm interested in the impact on climate of having so many battery powered devices.
Oh yeah, totally. I'm not sure actually if there's like, here's a preferred ratio. There's been a long time for one-on-one robot interaction as a very clear area, whether that's in the domain of education or whatnot. But then now that technology's become more sophisticated, and people are interested in questions like, well, when you have a robot in a group, how does that work? So, for example, robots in museums, robots in malls, like how is that all working? I think you also have the model of like the personal robot. So, for example, maybe you have something like an Amazon Alexa in your bathroom, and then there's a robot on your kitchen counter, and then in your car there's your smart agent. So how are those connected? And so looking at, well, there's something everywhere to help you. So I don't think there's yet been a gold standard of robots to people, or what people would like. And I think it also probably depends on what type of robot it is as well, whether you're in a manufacturing environment or whether you're in your house with a robot. I know when I talk to a lot of people, they're always like, I need multiple robots. I need one that's going to clean my floors. I need someone that's going to like, so you have like the Roomba, then you have like something more like Jibo, which is a social robot. And then you have like someone who's going to do your laundry for you. So I think you can imagine the field is super diverse in just what those ratios look like. In terms of the climate side, I myself has not thought about that, nor have I really seen a lot of that work. To be fair, when I'm looking at the literature, I'm looking for what are the discussions around equity or justice or ethics. And so far, I think HRI has focused very much on the people domain and dimension of that. Or maybe you could even say they also think about then, well, what's the moral character of a robot, or how is that robot going to develop morals? But I've not seen as much around sustainability. And I think I've seen a lot more of the focus of sustainability, or how is technology going to impact climate in mechanical engineering, which I'm a little more familiar with. But I am not familiar with any conversations around that yet in robotics.
Yeah, Anastasia, a follow-up question on robotics in the sense of biomedical devices like micro, miniaturized sensors, that can become intelligent agents. I mean, that's we have science fiction dystopic pictures of that, but do you know of people that are working on that in terms of small robots and what those things might be able to do?
I know there's definitely people working on it, definitely not my area. So I think I'll just end it there, because I don't know much more than that, but I do know there's definitely researchers that are working. There may be I think there's some people in the Media Lab that work on the smart sensing side. And I have heard of like, could robots be used in your body? Don't know much more than you on that, George, or maybe you even know more than I do.
Yeah. No, just the question occurred. The other thing that was interesting is I read recently about what happens if we find that we build these really good, really nice, really useful, really smart robots, and we find that we prefer them to other humans.
Yeah, I mean, I think you hear stories of people that get married to agents or get married to VR creations, and so I think there would probably be a portion of the population that would do that. And I think then the question becomes, are we okay with that as a society? Is it harming the person? Is the person okay with that? So I think it does open some really interesting ones. There's a lot of conversation in the space around, robots and relationships, right? And even romantic relationships. And how does that, what does that mean? How does it change how we interact? Could that help us interact better with people? And I think in our lab, a lot of the times it is looking at, well, how can these technologies help people flourish? And so if someone is making a relationship with a robot, whether it's a child or an older adult, they have a relationship. Now, what do we do from there? And so there's a lot of work that questions, like, what does it mean for us to have a relationship with a robot? And how do we characterize that?
Yeah, those are good questions. So Katherine, you have your hand up. So what's up?
I do, because I'm also familiar with some of the work coming out of the Media Lab, where Cynthia Brazil, who is Anastasia's advisor, is our new Dean of Digital Learning. And so kind of sticking with the thread of relationships, but more going back to our conversations about equity. I was wondering if you work with or could speak to the robots that or how robots rather could be tools of equity themselves, where I'm specifically thinking of the literacy robots, which are purposely created to be fuzzy and cute, so children would want to interact with them, and then the robot helps them learn how to read.
Yeah, and I think there's like two dimensions of that as well. So there's the robots themselves that could be, you know, supporting children's literacy, you know, in multiple populations, especially, you know, we think about very early education, right? If you could have this robot really giving you personalized learning, it could help, you know, make more so of a level playing field. And I think for us as robotists, we're very excited for that vision. And a lot of our technology, you know, we really work in our approaches in the lab to, you know, be solving a need or a problem. And I think a big thing for robotics is similar to something that happens in human computer interaction. So there's a really nice phrase that's called the digital divide. You may have heard of it, but what it basically says is, you know, not everyone has access to the technology to be digital. And I think, you know, with current robotics where they're running on Wi-Fi or, you know, they're not as robust yet, there is, I think, a big area where this could become sort of what's called the robotic divide. And there's researchers that looked at this mostly in the legal field, but they also point this out, you know, if we want to build an equitable technology, we need to start also engaging in other areas that are meant to support this technology. If Wi-Fi is not available to everyone and no one has access to, or not everyone has access to Wi-Fi, how can we have these systems be equitable, right? If we would want to work with children who maybe don't have access to, you know, early pre-K before public school learning, how do we do that if they also don't have Wi-Fi? So I think there's a lot of surrounding things to think about the support system to make this equitable as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's great. And there's David put a comment in the chat, and I just wanted to bring that up. And that's the concept of storytelling, I guess, arises as you know, being able to tell a story is a way of engaging with people and their relationships. And I guess in terms of changing the way people think about any of these things, is Katherine still on to kind of talk about the importance of, like, science fiction has a role to play in terms of bringing new ideas forward and getting to think in different ways. But a lot of science fiction is just kind of like, you know, that's particularly the TV and the movies tend to, you know, make this look in a certain way. And so, Katherine, talk about the importance of storytelling.
Oh, where do I begin? So for those of you who don't know, I have a background in book publishing, so this is an excellent question for me. So yeah, that is the question. We can never undervalue the importance of storytelling. And I think it's really funny to go back to examples of early science fiction, as I forget who now, but they were saying in the chat that we had predictions of television, of what a digital phone would be, rather, a device in your hand that could do everything you could conceive of. And so there's just, I guess the thing about science fiction is less about the devices, and more about the humans surrounding those devices, where science fiction is usually a vehicle to discuss social issues of the time, and history tends to have cyclical patterns. So maybe that's why we can look back at previous generations and see similar themes in the works of those times. And yeah, maybe we can use the current works of the day to predict the future, but only time will tell who got it right and who had wild speculation, but it's a fun ride regardless.
Yeah, and I guess the other part of it I'm thinking of is the way we inspire people. How do we inspire people? All five of you are working in areas where we're trying to inspire change and bring out ideas and get people, you know, into something. So there's the inspiration that can come from how you tell a story and how you create a narrative. I think, you know, how do we teach those skills?
Yeah, because in storytelling, there's a rule where you can either have a happy ending where the protagonist gets what they want, a happy ending where they didn't get what they want, but they're happy anyways. an unhappy ending where they got what they want, but it's bittersweet, or purely desolate ending, it's unhappy, they didn't get what they want. So yeah, to inspire people, I guess most people would want that the happy ending and everything works out perfectly, but maybe a story of triumph over adversity was like, okay, you didn't get what you want, but there's a hopeful tenor at the end that even though they didn't get it this time, maybe next time around humanity will persevere. So yeah, depends on the story, depends on the storyteller, but I think in any of those four paths, you can find a way to inspire people.
Oh, that's
Excellent,
interesting.
yeah.
We have a question from Barry in the audience. Go ahead, Barry.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thanks. Yep.
So people have been talking about people seeing robots, giving them human qualities, treating them as people. As robots become more common, do we have to worry about the opposite? People dehumanizing other people increasingly. I mean, we already see, for example, the horror stories coming out of Amazon warehouses. Earlier, in the Industrial Revolution, you had all sorts of abuses going on. And now if you have these machines that you communicate with, that you have these relationships with, and when they get troublesome, you just replace them or turn them off or whatever. How do you prevent that from, it won't happen to everybody, but how do you prevent that from just, causing further abuses and dehumanizing of other people as, their humanity becomes even less apparent?
Yeah, so I think that it's a really interesting space, and a lot of people are looking at the role that robots play with relation to humans' relationships. And I think I think what I'm drawn to is sort of thinking about like industrial robots. And so I was just meeting with someone who owns a who works in a furniture factory in Germany, and they got robots. And so they've been talking about how they successfully have been integrating them. And I think an interesting model that's often used is a cobot model, which is like, oh, you're going to work together. So it's kind of like a partnership, but I also think there are different strategies for engaging. So for example, the very monotonous task that no one wanted to do, that's where they put the robots. And that was really, great and successful for them. Everyone's like, oh, this is amazing. We don't have to do this anymore. I love doing this. Or for example, there was another task where they kind of put a robot in, but like kind of half the time, so that let the worker go do a more meaningful task. And so there's a lot of conversations around meaningfulness and with regards to robotics, so that a robot in a place will help you do more meaningful work. And I think so that's something to look at, is like, how are these being introduced and what role do they have? And I think another important area then is thinking about more so, sorry, I lost my train of thought for a second. The autonomy of it, right? So I think that's something you got at, is who's controlling the system, but also it comes into, if it's putting in my space against my will, like I want to have control of it, or like who is putting the authority of putting that in my environment, and why don't I have a choice? So, when we talk about co-design in industrial areas is something I'm really interested in. And, if you have workers involved in the design process of a robot or an implementation process of a robot, how does that change adoption and use? And I love the question around like, oh, well, they're just going to turn it off, because we see that all the time. And I see it as a very humorous thing. And I'll tell you why, because when I run studies, like I've given older adults robots, and they're designing with us, but they're also living with the robot too. So we give them like a concrete experience with the technology. And so I've gotten to look at a lot of their data, and there's this group of people who are super fascinating, because there's like, this is the data, there's a peak, and then there's no usage. And I love these people because it's so fascinating. And they tell you, it was watching me, it was creepy, I didn't want to use it. Or I only wanted to use it with my family, and then my family told me it was creepy, so I didn't want to use it. Like, there was no use for it. I turned it off. Like, and so we can learn a lot from non-usage. And I think it also challenges us as designers, because, you know, the always on model is like, let's collect a bunch of data and then we're going to know everything and people great. But what if people turn it off? Like, you can't collect any data. So it challenges you as a designer to also consider, okay, these are human patterns. So how do we design thinking about their needs in mind and adapt our work to it? I'm not saying it's easy by any means. But I think there's a lot to learn from non-usage, and what is non-usage really saying in a person's relationship to a system. That doesn't touch as much on some of the other issues you mentioned with robots, like abuse and whatnot. And there are researchers that work in that area around the technology, because it is such a complex space when we talk about relationships.
Yeah, one of the themes that seems to rise up is that any of these technologies they're an accelerator for what humans are. So, and if we have issues of power and control and discrimination and, you know, attitudes and really the power and control issue, if we have those as people, then that new technology comes along and it really serves as an accelerant, you know, like throwing gas on the fire, and it can be really, really good and can be really, really bad. And so I think, David, you were talking about that. Do you want to just talk about that, technology as an accelerant, and how do we kind of get a handle on that?
I think that's a really helpful characterization, that technologies amplify some of our own biases, habits of mind, or preferences. I would also say that, you know, like, technologies don't just happen, though. Like, you know, they're designed by people, you know, and we're all imperfect, right? So in that sense, like, imperfect people create imperfect technologies, and in something of a positive feedback loop, they reinforce, right? And so I think, I don't know, I don't have like the best, like, I don't have the best way to put a bow on it, but I do think like we have to be critical users of technology, and really think about like what kinds of patterns of behavior or outlooks that technologies habituate us to as well.
Yeah.
You know, and earlier it might have been Ellen who was on, or someone mentioned this just a few minutes ago, but like, I wonder about the little kids. Like, I have a nephew who's going to be 4, and he spent most of his life basically at home, not really socializing because of the pandemic, you know. And so what is his relationship with, you know, Alexas or iPads or whatever? You know, how does that structure, you know, like these formative bits of worldview? And if everything is designed to be the robot assistant that is your helpful, you know, assistant, you know, or does that like imprint or leave a mark, and like set different expectations for social relations? Are more relations transactional, or, you know, authoritarian in the loose sense? I don't know. I don't have too much intelligent to say about that, but I do think it's like an area of question that we should be mindful of, you know.
Yeah, even as we're proceeding down the road, we are changing the way human beings react with that world. That's changing us as human beings, you know, the brain structures and everything else, all changing kind of on the fly. So we probably can't know those things in advance. It's uncertain. But we're going there, so let's be aware of that.
Not to get all like Bruno Latour, but like, you know, like the technologies create like different kinds of stakeholders too, right?
Yeah.
Like actor network theory is like, okay, well, you know, like we have environmentalists who join the Sierra Club, and because like they are members of the Sierra Club, Sean, Bruno Latour is the chat, you know, like, but they become like people who act from that environmental position, right? Like, we invent automobiles or the internal combustion engine or firearms, and we have gun people, we have car people, and we have different stakeholders, you know. And so like we have to think about the kinds of people that we craft with technology as well, you know?
Yeah.
And if I could do a hard pivot for a sec, I wanted to ask a question of Sudeep earlier too, or not a question so much as like an invitation to hold forth, just in that panelists asking each other stuff thing. But I would love it if you could, I mean, as we're talking about like the ways technologies habituate us to things, I mean, first off, I mean, when we think about using organisms as factories, you know, are we over instrumentalizing, or where do we draw lines between, you know, instrumentalization? Like we look at factory farming now, and most people would say that factory farming of animals is a bad thing, you know, like to cultivate animals for their meat under these conditions, right? You know, and like, what's the microbial equivalent of that? Or, you know, if you don't like that question, maybe something about like safety in you know, like when more genetic engineering methods and inputs are more widely accessible, how do we think about like democratizing access in that, you know, potentially negative case of safety? Yeah, so take your pick, but like I was curious about both of those things as you were speaking.
Well, can I just say, like, you know, you and I are related. I don't know if you know that 15,000 years ago, we had a common ancestor who was clutching their pearls at these people who were you know, fermenting grain and then drinking. You know, they're drinking rotten grain water. What are they doing? And I mean that as a joke, obviously, but there's something to that. I think biology has always been a technology that we've harnessed, right? And it's a matter of how we harness that, how we're harnessing that biology. I don't mean this to be glib, but the difference between the biotechnology that we were doing 10,000 years ago, literally almost 15,000 years ago, we have evidence that brewing and drinking beer predates actual agriculture, right? So people were nomadic and brewing beer. But the technology really has stayed the same, right? The technologies that we're using to brew the proteins that are involved in different flavorants, these fragrances that we're talking about, are really the same processes that we've had for a very, very long time, right? And not to turn your own words against you, but the technologies that the technologies that we've been dealing with have actually shaped humanities, right? We find this in culture, right? We find this written in the Gilgamesh, right? Enkidu becomes civilized after he drinks beer and eats bread, right? In the same way, now that we can think about what is civilization, what is civilized eating, and what is informed eating, and what is informed food. Well, something which has a low carbon footprint, something which is lower cruelty to animals, right? Something which is sustainable. I don't mean to turn this glib, but we're still talking about different technologies. The way that it's being the way that it's different from 10,000 years ago is that we've been able to make small changes to the genetic code, which allows it to produce very different organisms, right?
I'm gonna have to just hold off a little bit.
Oh,
You know,
sorry,
we're way past
Sorry.
time we usually are. So anybody that needs to leave, feel free to leave. Anybody that wants to stay for a while until we start falling asleep or whatever, you know, is good too. So if you have to leave, that's fine. And yeah, you're way early in the morning out there. So your fortitude in terms of sticking with it, my hat's off to you. Thank you very much. So thanks everybody.